Welcome to the Best Interest Podcast, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello and welcome to the Best Interest Podcast. My name is Jesse Kramer. This is episode 99 of the podcast. It's an AMA, an Ask Me Anything episode where you send in your personal finance, your financial planning, your investment questions, and I provide some detailed, intricate, hopefully interesting and educational answers. And today we have 5 great questions to work through. But first, as always, we have a review of the week. This review comes from JBeetle3, and Jay said, episode 96 is required listening. I listen to a lot of personal finance content, and episode 96 is the best explanation of why index long-term investing is the most effective path to wealth. I love this podcast's reasonable and measured tone and explanations. Well, JBeetle, thank you very much. I'm glad episode 96 resonated with you, and listeners, I do think episode 96 is good. I think it's very helpful, and I encourage you all to listen to it if you haven't listened to it yet. And JBeetle, shoot me an email, jesse@bestinterest.blog, and we'll get you hooked up with a nice soft Best Interest t-shirt. And speaking of the email address, jesse@bestinterest.blog, listeners, that's how you can send in your questions for episodes like this, the Ask Me Anything episodes. But before we get to the first question, we have a second short, fun announcement. Episode 100 is right around the corner, and we will be announcing a small branding change in episode 100. So while I have affection for the triple meaning of the Best Interest as a name, the simple fact is that not everybody out there who hears those words, the Best Interest, immediately thinks to themselves, oh, it must be an educational personal finance podcast. So we're making a small change to target the fact that we want people to find the show and we want people to know exactly what we're all about. So we'll be making that announcement in episode 100. And plus, in episode 100, we'll have a fun look back on the journey that got us this far into the podcast and this far into the Best Interest as a brand, and a few more things that I won't spoil quite yet. And with that, let's begin the AMA. The first question comes from Randy. Randy said, Jesse, I've been thinking about what it means to be rich, and I'm curious to hear what you think. For me, you're rich if you have enough net worth to generate passive income like dividends, rent, or interest yield to equal what the top 10% of workers make. So for example, in the US, the top 10% of households earn about $200,000 a year. So you'd need around $5 million of net worth to be considered rich, assuming a 4% passive income, because 4% of $5 million is $200,000 per year. Of course, it varies by city and where you live. What do you think? How do you define being rich? So, Randy, interesting question, and it reminds me of the way an engineer might answer that question, so I can appreciate your thought process there, and I'll try to answer it a few different ways. Now, the first one, I want to start by asking, why exactly does this matter? Why does being rich matter? And a step further, why does my definition of rich matter? Now, my hope is that you're asking this question to me because maybe you respect my opinion and you're interested to hear my definition of rich as opposed to someone else's definition of rich, maybe to act as a guidepost toward your own definitions. I do that all the time in my own life, right? I ask my mentors questions simply to hear their answers and ultimately to guide or inform my own answers. In thinking about this, I have clients who have more than $10 million. I have clients with a few $100,000 or $1 million. Now, is one of those people rich? Is one of those families rich? And is one of them not rich? Now, I would think it's somewhat up to them as individuals to determine if 10 million or 1 million or some other number has them feeling rich. Part of your question, Randy, it made me think of the book Factfulness, which I've talked about here on the podcast before. And the book Factfulness divides the world into 4 unique tiers. Every person on earth falls into one of those 4 tiers based on the resources they consume on a daily basis. Now, tier 4 is the richest tier, and it's defined as living on $32 per day or more. Now, granted, the book was written in 2018, so today's tier 4 might be more like $40 per day. And almost everyone listening to this podcast falls into tier 3 or tier 4. Almost everyone listening to this podcast in the USA is almost assuredly in tier 4. But that said, only about 1 in 7 people on planet Earth as a whole are in tier 4. In other words, about 80% of our planet, maybe even more, they live on less than $40 per day. They live on less than $16,000 per year. And what does that actually look like to them? Well, it might mean that they don't have an indoor tap for water. They probably do have an outdoor pump from a well or something like that. They likely transport themselves on motorcycles, mopeds, bicycles, maybe on a bus. but way more than they would in a personal car. For them, schooling probably goes through age 18, but it probably does not go through college. Likely they cook on a proper indoor stove, but maybe on a small gas stove. They certainly don't, or they most likely don't have a grocery store that's teeming with foods the way that we might envision one in the West. Now, part of me wants to define the word rich by comparing myself or comparing us listening to that 80% of the global population who I just defined, who don't have indoor running tap water, who are almost assuredly not going to college, who very rarely are sitting inside of a personal car. So the framing of the question, though, is actually the opposite of that kind of person, right? The framing of your question, Randy, you took the top 10% of earners from the richest country in the world and then posed that we have so much money, or that someone can only be rich when they have so much money that they can passively out-earn those top 10% of earners. In other words, by sitting on our butts and doing nothing, we can earn more than the 90th percentile earners in the richest country on earth. So yes, I'd say the person who can do that is certainly rich. And for that matter, I think many of us listening to this podcast are rich. Do we always feel rich? No, we don't. Should we compare ourselves to rural Cambodians in order to feel rich or poor? No, not necessarily. I totally understand that part of us, our natural instinct is to compare ourselves to the Joneses. We're going to benchmark ourselves based on the society that we live in, the neighborhood that we live in, and the lifestyles that we want and hope for. But even on that axis, I'm not sure I have a specific dollar amount in mind in order to be rich. But I do have some interesting criteria to work through, and I think you'll see that some of these questions that I'm about to pose and the answers to them certainly can point you in the direction of quote unquote being rich. So the first question or criteria that comes to mind, do I need to work or could I choose to stop? The next one, how much more money do I need in order to live my desired lifestyle? How much choice do I have where I live, what I do, and when I do it without financial constraints? How much can I afford to travel, to indulge in hobbies, to create meaningful experiences regularly? Do I have ample free time to spend with loved ones or pursue passions without any sort of financial worry? Do I feel financial anxiety or do I feel financial security? Now, those are some interesting questions and criteria to work through that I think can start to point you towards whether you are rich or wealthy or however you want to put it. I mean, honestly, it's a bit semantics, right? The word itself doesn't matter. It's more about the feeling that we actually have of our connection with the money or the resources that we have in our life. For me, I think of those criteria that I just listed out and I say, well, I still need to work, but I'm living a very desirable lifestyle right now, at least for my desires. And I feel like I have a lot of choice in what I do and when I do it, though perhaps that's because I love my job. I love this side work I'm doing here on the Best Interest podcast. For that point of view, I feel like I have a lot of choice in what I do and when I do it because I'm doing something I like. I have lots of meaningful experiences, the fun stuff in life all the time. I do sometimes wish I had more free time to spend with my loved ones, and the only way to carve out that time would be to work less. I don't feel much financial anxiety, though. That is, I think, one of the great benefits of being on top of your financial plan. You simply know what's going on, and there's a huge positive benefit to that. So in some ways, I feel rich right now. In other ways, I'm working on it and getting closer. I suppose for me, I could tell you which financial numbers matter most in my life, where my income or net worth would actually have to be for me to feel even more comfortable. But I'm not sure how my number would actually apply into your life. In fact, I think that if I gave you my numbers, it would probably lead you to draw more bad conclusions than good ones, right? Because my numbers are pretty unique to me and my brain. So the amount of money that you're really searching for is enough. That's the amount, enough. And that's what you want. So interesting question, Randy. And I think it led to a pretty good thought experiment and answer, even if maybe it wasn't quite the answer that you were looking for. Okay, the next question number 2 is from Bob. He's got a 529 college savings question, but really it expands out into more of a tax question that is more general in nature. So Bob says, Jesse, for New York 529 accounts for my grandchildren, I've always had a concern that if they don't use the funds for education, there will be a penalty to withdraw those unused funds. Now, the recent buy-in by New York State of the Roth conversion rule, it lessens my concern. But let's imagine a future where they use some 529 for college, they convert some into their Roth IRAs, and then there's still money left over. My question is if either their mom, as the future owner of the account, or when the kids become adults, the beneficiaries themselves, if and when they remove money for non-educational expenses, are they required to pay back my tax credit, given years and years earlier? If so, how would that work? Their tax bracket may not be the same as mine at the time of the credit, or they may not even be a resident in the same state at that point. Okay, Bob, interesting question. A little bit of a complicated question. And listeners, I will work through some of that complication to make sure that you really understand what Bob is asking. And to be fair, listeners, this is going to involve federal taxes and state taxes. And the only fair thing for me to say up front is, hey, consult with your CPA or other tax professional to understand how you might be affected by some of what I'm about to say. But in short, a lot of tax things, they simply care about the amount of income that was received or not received in the specific year of the tax filing by the individual who is filing that tax return based on the state in which they are filing. Okay, what do I mean by that? So Bob is pointing out that his current 529 contributions are providing Bob himself a tax benefit on his 2025 tax returns based on his income in 2025 and based on the fact that he's a New York State resident. And as Bob points out, his grandkids could choose to use the $529 for a non-educational purpose. And that's going to create a tax liability and a penalty. And Bob's question is, well, does that penalty, does that tax liability, does it undo the benefit that Bob receives today? And if so, how does that work? The answer is no. It doesn't undo the benefit that Bob receives today. So I'm going to go back and kind of repeat the phrase I said a minute ago, which is that a lot of tax things, they care about the amount of income that was received in the specific year that one is filing taxes by the individual who is filing that tax return based on the state in which they are filing. So in the case of Bob's grandkids, if they fulfill Bob's fear of pulling out some of the $529 for non-qualified purposes, they will realize some sort of income and penalty in a future year on their own tax returns based on the state in which they are filing that future tax returns. There's no retroactive clawback of Bob's benefit, but instead, the grandkids are likely going to have to pay a tax and a penalty on their own, on their personal tax returns, or if they're still considered dependents of their parents, it might be on the parents' tax returns, in whatever state that occurs in that future year. Okay? It doesn't undo Bob's benefit right now. It's simply going to be a tax owed in a future year. In some cases, for some types of accounts, it could mean that someone is saving tax dollars today at a 35% rate, and that someone else is going to end up paying taxes in the future at a 12% rate, which is just an accidental tax savings that they stumbled into, and that's pretty nice. In other cases, though, it could mean that the person putting money in is saving dollars today, tax dollars at a 12% rate, but that someone else is going to pay taxes in the future at their much higher 35% rate, which is just accidental extra tax burden, which if you had known about it, you never would have contributed the money in the first place, right? It doesn't make sense to save 12% today in order to pay 35% in the future. So for many of us, what I just described is possible and will affect us through the form of inherited IRA accounts. When someone dies with a traditional IRA or a 401k or a Roth IRA, although I'll get to that later, basically when someone dies with an IRA or 401k, their beneficiaries will receive those assets via an inherited IRA. And new legislation recently passed so that all new inherited IRAs going forward are subject to the 10-year rule. They must be drained of all their assets within 10 years of formation, which is really more or less within 10 years of when the person died. If it's a Roth inherited IRA, there's no tax burden, right? Those are Roth dollars. So that principle of Roth dollars passes through to the inherited IRA and there's no tax burden. But for all traditional inherited IRAs, those withdrawals over the 10-year period, they will be taxable as income. The withdrawals can be equal over 10 years. It could be all at once after year 10. In some cases, RMD rules are going to apply. And also what I should say is for older inherited IRAs that already exist, well, different rules are going to apply to those. So be careful. It's definitely worth chatting with a financial planner to make sure that you don't get in trouble with the IRS when it comes to your personal inherited IRA. But the point of this question and answer right now is that the decedent, the person who died, they saved taxes on the front end when they contributed into their 401k or their IRA. And they saved taxes based on whatever tax rate they were paying in that particular year. It could have been 2015. It could have been 2000. It could have been it was in whatever state they were living in at that time. But here you are, say you've inherited the IRA now, and it's 2025 or 2026 or sometime in the future, and you are going to have to pay taxes on those IRA withdrawals. and it's based on however much income you are earning during that year. And there are some cases where it's a little unfortunate, if you will. It's a nice problem to have, I suppose, but someone will be in the middle of their career. They're in some of their higher earning years. Their marginal tax bracket is say 32 or 35 or 37% at the federal level. And then their grandfather dies, unfortunately. They get an inherited IRA from their grandfather. And now here they are. They have to take IRA withdrawals out of the inherited IRA. It counts as income. They're already in the highest tax bracket. They're already paying 37%. And so grandpa, he might have made those contributions once upon a time and saved money at 22%. And unfortunately for him, his grandchild is now paying the federal government back at 37%. Unfortunate, but unavoidable. But the important point, getting back to Bob's original question, is that the government is not clawing back grandpa's tax savings. That is not how it works. Instead, the government is simply looking at today's situation, which is you've inherited this IRA. What state do you live in? What is your income in this current tax year? And the applicable tax rates based on whatever state you're living in will apply. Excellent question. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, let me know. And as I mentioned, Bob's specific 529 question likely is not going to apply to many people listening, but the inherited IRA example is definitely going to apply to a lot of people listening right now. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Did you know my written blog, The Best Interest, was nominated for 2022 Personal Finance Blog of the Year, and it's been highlighted in the Wall Street Journal, Yahoo Finance, and on CNBC? I love writing, especially when that writing is to share financial education, and I usually write 1 or 2 articles per week. You can read them all at bestinterest.blog. Again, the web address is bestinterest.blog. Check it out. Okay, question number 3 from Tom. Jesse, I've seen this mentioned a couple times in forums, but kind of wondering why it is not mentioned more. Let's say I do not have very much in taxable accounts in my retirement, and I need to pull $100,000 from my IRA every year for living expenses until Social Security kicks in. I could pull that amount and put it into a money market fund to spend, or I could actually do a Roth conversion of the same exact amount and then pull the money from the Roth when I need it for living expenses. Any interest income I received in the Roth would then not be taxed. It seems like it would work and save on some taxes paid on interest. I feel like I must be missing something since this is rarely mentioned by other people. I would love your thoughts on this. So, listeners, Tom, in short, has a pretty good point. There are 2 distinct paths that Tom is describing in his question. The first one is withdrawing $100,000 from a traditional IRA, just a normal distribution out of the IRA, which counts as taxable income, putting that money, after taxes are paid, into a simple taxable brokerage account, investing it into a money market fund, and then using that money for this year's spending. The second path that Tom describes is to do a Roth conversion of the $100,000 from the traditional IRA into a Roth IRA. Doing so will realize the same exact amount of taxable income, but then the money is sitting not in a taxable brokerage account, but instead in a Roth IRA, where Tom could choose to buy the same exact money market fund for that year's spending. Now, in the first scenario, as our spending money in the money market fund accrues some interest, that interest will end up as taxable interest income at year end. But in the second scenario, in the Roth IRA, the money can accrue interest and the interest will be tax-free. So Tom is right. You can save money doing it in the way he describes. Now, there are some caveats. So one thing to keep in mind, and a big thing to keep in mind, especially depending on how old you are, there are 2 separate and therefore very confusing 5-year rules that apply to Roth contributions and Roth conversions. Yes, there are 2 different rules. They're similar in some ways, mainly in the way that they both deal with a period that's 5 years long. They're both often called the 5-year rule, but they're different rules. And they both apply to Roth IRAs, and that's quite confusing. The first one is sometimes called the 5-year aging rule. And what it describes is that at least 5 years must elapse between the beginning of the tax year of your first contribution to a Roth account and the withdrawal of earnings. If fewer than 5 years have passed before you make a withdrawal of earnings, the withdrawal is considered a non-qualified distribution and will likely be subject to taxes or penalties or both. Of course, many of us are familiar with the withdrawal age for retirement accounts, which is 59 and a half years old. But this 5-year rule also applies. So even if you're 61 years old, let's say, you still need to wait for your Roth IRA to be 5 tax years old before you can withdraw earnings in that account. If this example 61-year-old did withdraw earnings, those earnings would be considered income and they'd pay taxes on them. Once the 5-year rule has been met, the earnings are no longer considered income. And importantly there, you will notice that I kept on using the word earnings. There's a difference in any account, but especially now we're going to make a difference. We're going to highlight the difference between contributions and earnings. This 5-year rule, the 5-year aging rule, applies to the earnings in an account. You can withdraw the contributions at any time, tax or penalty free, from a Roth IRA. Now, the second 5-year rule is very specific to Roth conversions, and it applies often in the early retirement community where people utilize Roth conversions for annual spending in retirement. That 5-year rule, the second one, states that if someone converts traditional IRA assets to Roth assets, and even if they pay all the required taxes on that conversion, they must still wait 5 years before withdrawing those converted dollars. This could be a little confusing. It probably is, because some of you might be asking, well, how could they withdraw the money anyway if they are under 59 and a half years old? Well, we have to go back to contributions versus earnings. Anything that you contribute to a Roth IRA account can be pulled back out at any time for any reason, tax and penalty free, at any age. Earnings cannot be touched until age 59 and a half, lest penalties and taxes apply. So this second 5-year rule says, hey, just because you converted money from a traditional to a Roth, and just because you have paid the taxes on it, that does not mean that you can immediately withdraw it as if it was a contribution. It's not a contribution, it's a conversion. And because it's conversion, you have to wait 5 years before you can touch it. So those are the two 5-year rules. Now, once we've successfully navigated any 5-year rule concerns, then Tom's idea makes a lot of sense. If we're pulling money out of a traditional IRA anyway, why not convert it to a Roth instead of depositing it into a bank account, a money market account, or other non-qualified account? I believe the reason why Tom's idea isn't discussed very often is simple logistics, and it's a question of, is the juice worth the squeeze? So to explain, let's use Tom's hypothetical numbers. We want to pull $100,000 out for living expenses. So either way, whether we're converting it to a Roth or depositing it into a taxable account, our income tax bill is going to be the same on that actual $100,000 change, if you will. And in both cases, due to the timeline of our future spending, right? It's this year's spending. I want to assume we're investing those dollars into a money market fund, which as of this recording, we will say is yielding 4.0%. So we'll pull on the money monthly to fund our lifestyle. So 1/12 of the money is going to earn interest for a month. And 1/12 of the money is going to earn the interest for 2 months and 3 months and 4 months, et cetera, et cetera. So by the end of the year, we're going to earn about $2,000 in interest in the account. In the Roth account, the $2,000 is not taxed at all. And in the non-qualified account, it's taxed at probably a combined federal and state tax level of something like 25 to 40%. So it's probably going to be a $500 to an $800 total tax bill in the taxable account. And in this world of financial planning, yes, every penny count, a penny saved is a penny earned. And when we realize that we're talking about a 0.5% to a 0.8% savings using Tom's plan, I'd say, yeah, that moves the needle. But for some people, the annoyance caused by the Roth conversion up front and the extra tax forms that come along with that, and the extra transfers every month from the Roth account into a taxable account from which you can spend, those logistics might not be worth it. The juice, as I said, might not be worth the squeeze. There's no doubt about it. It is a way to save money, but the Roth conversion path will take some extra time and some vigilance to set up and to get correct. Is that few $100s worth it in tax savings? For some people, yes, and for other people, no. Okay, the fourth question comes from loyal listener Yogi, who writes in from the Pacific Northwest. And Yogi says, Jesse, my question is in regards to the AMA question from fellow listener Dan in episode 95 with regards to bonds. It was a great lesson from you, as I too did not know how to evaluate bond performance correctly or how interest rate movements have a direct impact on bond prices. My question is in regards to bonds' role as a diversification asset in our portfolio. If total bond funds such as VBLTX include bonds of various durations, investment grades, and types, government or corporate, wouldn't it be better to invest in short-term government bonds such as T-bonds, municipal bonds, if my goal is to minimize my overall portfolio risk? Yogi, I think this is a great question, and I want to start the answer with a little story. I sit on the board of directors for a nonprofit here in Rochester. It's called Lollipop Farm. We're considered one of the preeminent animal welfare organizations in the country. It's a physical location, a shelter, an animal shelter, an amazing fostering unit, world-class veterinary services. We have an animal humane law enforcement officers. We have 5 officers on staff. So we serve this huge geographical region enforcing humane animal laws. A lot of education goes on, and we help any sort of companion animal or farm animal that you can think of: dogs, cats, gerbils, emus, horses, potbelly pigs, whatever. It's a cool place. Now, the point I'm bringing it up is that I had a really interesting conversation with some folks who are on the investment committee for the nonprofit about exactly your question, Yogi. The question is, does it make sense to dial up the risk inside of a bond allocation? Because ostensibly, we own bonds because of their stability over short durations. At least that's how I think about it. If there's one thing that I harp on, whether it's in my blog posts or here on the podcast, when it comes to goals-based investing or financial planning and thinking about our unique goals, assigning a timeline to those goals, and then finding the proper asset class based on that timeline, the reason for bonds is if we say, well, I have a short-term goal and I need money in a year or 2 years or 4 years. Maybe I don't want to hold it just in cash. I'm willing to get a little bit of extra return, and a bond is the right investment in that case. Stocks are not a 2-year asset class, but bonds are, if it's the right bonds. So the reason we own bonds is because of their stability over such a short duration. I have a very high level of confidence that if I invest my money today in a high-grade bond and I need it for a goal that I have in 3 years, that I will get my money back in 3 years with some interest. And that confidence, it doesn't exist for stocks, not over a 3-year timeline. So that's why bonds are more appropriate for that timeline than stocks. So we own bonds for the feeling of guarantee that our principal will be there exactly as we intend in the next 6 or 12 or 24 or 48 months, something like that. We own bonds so that not if, but when our stock allocation is negatively affected by a market correction or a crash, that our bond balance will remain largely unaffected. In fact, it might even go up while stocks go down. We own bonds for that kind of dependability. And the bonds that we choose for this type of job must be, by definition, quite liquid in nature, right? We want them to be an asset that other people are willing to buy from us at just about any time, but especially at times when the rest of the world or the rest of the financial markets are panicking. We want to own bonds that we can convert to spending money during those panicky times. So to Yogi's point, what if we introduce long duration bonds into our portfolio? What if we introduce low credit quality bonds or other exotic types of fixed income, not necessarily bonds, but they have a fixed income like return that just happen to have some sort of narrow, thin trading liquidity? The answer, or part of the answer, is just that, yeah, Yogi, not all bonds are equal. We have 1-year treasuries, we have 30-year treasuries. Well, there's a big difference there. The shorter the bond, the less it is affected by changes in global interest rates, and therefore the more dependable it is. Credit quality was another thing I brought up there. And credit quality is another way of saying, do I believe that the bond issuer will actually pay me back? You can go out, listeners, right now and find bond funds that are going to yield 8 or 9%. Well, a government bond's only yielding 4%. The difference is that the higher yielding bond fund, it's full of individual bonds from companies or from municipalities like a city or a county or a state, where the promise of getting paid back is very much up in the air. Basically, someone has lent money to a risky business or to a risky municipality, and there's a distinct chance of bankruptcy before the loan could ever be repaid. So the 7 or 8 or 9% yield, it's far from guaranteed. And the reason why it's so high is to try to compensate an investor to take that risk in the first place. Do you want the fixed income in your portfolio to have that specific feature? I would argue no. And lastly, on the liquidity front, not all bonds and not all fixed income in general is created equal. U.S. Treasuries, they are bought and sold and trusted all over the world. But a bond issued by Monroe County, New York, that's the county I live in, well, it's not the same, right? It's not bought and sold and trusted all over the world. And far fewer investors are willing to own or trade it. So what happens if you need to raise money for something in your life, for one of your stated goals, and all you have are some sort of exotic fixed income asset that trades very thinly, that not many people are trading on the open market? Well, option one is that you don't get to trade that day. You don't get to raise money that day. You don't get to sell your bond that day. You need to do it, but you don't get to do it because there isn't a buyer on the other side of the market. You're kind of screwed. Option two isn't much better. It's that someone is willing to trade with you, but only at a dumpster fire price. It's either trade with me for 50 cents on the dollar or go back to option one where you don't get to raise money at all. So for all those reasons, Yogi, I'm of the belief that you absolutely need to consider bond quality bond duration, bond liquidity as part of your portfolio construction. The whole purpose for bonds in the first place is to deal with these short-term needs, and we need to depend on them. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're only allowed to own 1-year U.S. Treasuries. It is possible and reasonable, and even I'd say an outright good thing to diversify your bond portfolio in other ways. But just know that there are differences here worth paying attention to. A 60-40 allocation is fine. It's great, whatever. But if the 40% bond allocation is really just a loan that you made to your brother-in-law's, pizzeria franchise, I find that to be pretty scary. Not all bonds, not all loans are created equal, and hopefully this answer shines a little bit of light on that. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Serious question. Why do podcasters constantly ask for ratings and reviews? Yes, they do help highlight our shows to new listeners. They help strangers find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's totally true and a good reason to ask for ratings and reviews. But I have something more important, at least more important to me. I want to know if you like this stuff. I want to know if you like my podcast episodes, my monologues, my guests, the information I share with you and the stories I tell. I want to improve and make your listening more enjoyable in the process. So yeah, I would love to read your reviews. And sure, if you throw a rating in there too, that's great. If you like what I'm doing, please share it with me. It's such a great feeling to read your feedback. I'd love to read your review or see a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you. The last question today comes in from Hector. Jesse, I recently came across an entertaining book, an old-style paperback, all about taxes, and the book is called Taxtopia, where the author discusses how wealthy people use the buy, borrow, die strategy to live off their investments without incurring capital gains taxes. The idea is that eventually they leave the loans and investments for their children to inherit free of capital gains tax. Can you explain this idea? Do you ever use it with your clients? And can you discuss the pros and cons of something like this? Yeah, Hector, it goes by different names, but yes, buy, borrow, die is a strategy that is popular, although I use that word lightly, popular approach purportedly utilized by the ultra wealthy to minimize tax liabilities and preserve capital across generations. At its core, the method leverages 3 steps to purchase an appreciating asset, like a stock or real estate or something like that, something that's growing, to borrow against that asset for liquidity instead of selling it. That's the big step. And we'll dive into this in a little more detail. You're not selling the asset after it's gone up in value. Instead, you're borrowing money and using the asset as collateral when you borrow. And then ultimately, upon your death, to transfer the assets to your heirs, where they will receive a stepped up cost basis, and therefore they will not inherit any sort of capital gains burden. And that's just a feature or a bug of the current tax code, where when you die, your heirs receive your assets not at the price at which you paid for them, but instead at the price of which they're worth today. So the benefit, people would argue, is that you're saving a lot of capital gains taxes by never selling your appreciated assets. But in my opinion, it doesn't seem like anyone ever wants to talk about the interest, because right, there's a borrow in there. You're borrowing money. Ostensibly, you're paying loan interest. No one ever really wants to talk about the loan interest that you're paying along the way. And the question, or at least one of the questions that jumps to my mind is, would I rather pay a one-time 15% or 20% capital gains tax versus paying 8% annual interest on a loan that grows year over year over year because I'm continually borrowing more money for the rest of my life? Now, granted, the interest rate of the loan is going to be an incredibly important factor here, and we'll get into that. So while the strategy might appear elegant, interesting, and straightforward, there are a few misconceptions that seem to surround its application and definitely carry some potential risk and drawbacks if it's mismanaged. And then I'll also explain a little bit of the math, as I'm wont to do, put together a spreadsheet to help me understand this better. And then I asked a bunch of my colleagues what they thought of it or if they've heard of it. So I've got some of their opinions too. So one of the big misunderstandings and false assumptions is that one can indefinitely borrow money against their assets without repercussions. In reality, a lender will assess the value of your assets and impose some pretty strict limits on the amount of credit or the amount of loans that are extended to you. And then market fluctuations, negative fluctuations, can reduce asset values, potentially triggering what's called a margin call, or the urgent need to repay your loan. That constraint can make buy, borrow, die impractical or unreliable or a little bit risky if borrowing is the only way that you're supplying your liquidity needs. And that's why market volatility is a major risk of the strategy. If the value of the underlying assets drops significantly, again, it leads to a margin call. Here's an example. And this applies not only to this buy, borrow, die strategy, but just about any kind of loan that exists here in our current economic system. So let's say I have $1 million in stocks, and we'll use that as an example because that's probably how buy, borrow, die is going to work. And I want to borrow $500,000. Let's say I want to build a house. The bank, or maybe even the brokerage, because a lot of brokers like Schwab or Fidelity, they have lines of credit too. They're going to look at me and say, okay, Jesse, yep, you want to borrow $500,000 on $1 million balance. Your loan to value is 50%. It's 500 divided by $1 million. And we say that's okay. To us, our limit is 60%. That's where we draw the line. As soon as your loan is more than 60% of whatever the underlying value is, we're going to give you a margin call. Okay. So, but for now, I'm fine, right? But then let's fast forward and say that a couple weeks down the line after I secure this loan, there's a pretty big correction in the stock market and my stock portfolio is cut by 20%. So I still have a $500,000 loan, but now I only have $800,000 of assets, right? My $1 million dropped by 20%. It's only $800,000 now. And if you do some mental math, 500,000 divided by 800,000 is 62.5%. Well, the lender, they had a pretty strict 60% limit, and I'm now violating that limit. So what they're going to force me to do, and it really is forced. It's not like they're going to give me, a few months to figure this out. They are going to immediately margin call me, and they're going to say, Jesse, you need to immediately pay us enough principal against this loan to drop your loan value down to 60%. So you say, well, what's 60% of 800,000? I believe it's 480,000. So I just borrowed $500,000. Now I'm only allowed to have $480,000 of credit. The difference there is 20 grand. So pretty much overnight, I have to come up with 20 grand to immediately start paying back this loan. That's a margin call. And in the buy, borrow, die strategy, margin calls are very possible. And then there's the possibility of regulatory and tax changes. Tax laws are subject to change. Legislative reforms could alter or eliminate key benefits of the strategy in the first place. For example, if the step up in basis is somehow repealed, or if estate tax thresholds are lowered, the strategy's advantages might be significantly diminished, leaving heirs with a lot more tax liability than the dying person, the decedent, intended. So all that said, one of my guiding principles here on The Best Interest is to let the numbers be thy guide. So I used my trusty Microsoft Excel to look at the long-term costs and benefits of such a buy, borrow, die strategy versus the much more traditional path of normal withdrawals and associated capital gains taxes. I'll admit this much. The results are not what I expected. Depending on your assumptions, which are very important here, what's the interest rate on the loans, on the borrowing? What do we assume are the returns on investment and what kind of volatility is associated with those? What are the capital gains tax rates is a huge one, et cetera, et cetera. Now, depending on those assumptions, one could make a pretty plausible argument in favor of buy, borrow, die. And I'd be happy to make that spreadsheet publicly available if you're curious. And the reason, in short, the underlying numerical reason, is that the buy, borrow, die technique allows the investor to keep more of their capital working in the investment markets. And as long as those extra investment returns can pay for the cost of their growing debt, then the buy, borrow, die strategy is definitely a net positive. But the problem, and it is a scary problem, comes when we begin to add volatility to the expected returns. Now, no retirement plan is going to look great during periods of negative investment return or negative volatility, but the buy, borrow, die plan faces a really nasty possibility of that margin call that we just talked about. In short, the amount of debt grows too high compared to the amount of invested principal, and the bank or the lender forces the borrower to immediately pay down the debt. And because there's leverage involved, and this is true in so many financial situations, whenever leverage is involved, the good tends to be extra good and the bad tends to be extra bad. Leverage is what Warren Buffett calls it, and it's basically a financial weapon of mass destruction. Now, specifically, he was using that language to talk about options and options trading, but a lot of options trading is simply just leverage. You're levering up your bets 20 to 1, and that is a weapon of financial mass destruction, and this is no different. So buy, borrow, die, and the leverage involved in it, assuming markets perform really well, it's actually going to be pretty good. But when markets perform poorly, it's going to be extra bad, quite simply. And so under the circumstances of pretty reasonable negative volatility, I could find many scenarios in my spreadsheet where the normal retirement path ended up being perfectly healthy and the buy, borrow, die retirement path ended up spiraling out of control with rising levels of debt and diminishing levels of assets. And then as a last measure, I asked some of the financial planners, the accountants, the attorney I work with here, what their opinions on it were. And we're talking about families with, 1 million, 3 million, 5 million, all the way up to, we work with some families with hundreds of millions of dollars, offering them a true kind of family office style service. So I figure, well, if there's anyone out there, maybe some of them we use or recommend buy, borrow, and die. And the universal answer came back and it was, well, what do the numbers say? And how much risk are we taking? Are we avoiding a 20% capital gains tax just to pay an 8% loan forever? How many years are we going to pay that loan before the strategy backfires? Is the individual in question, are they 90 years old and on death's door? Because if we expect them to live for a few decades, it's hard to see how the math would ever work out in their favor. And yeah, what if investments decline? What if there's a margin call? Are we just exposing them to way more risk than they need to? And if someone has this much money, why are we exposing them to that much risk? And it actually brings up another interesting point. One of the biggest misconceptions that I hear and see on a regular basis is that somehow wealthy people with all their accountants, their financial planners, that they simply avoid taxes. And in my experience, at least, that is simply not true. The tax code is going to get us, every single one of us. And the question, though, is whether you understand the tax code well enough to make sure that you pay your share, but not any more than your share. And every week, it seems like, or every month, I come across a situation, I look at a tax return where I think, oh, this person paid more than they should have, definitely more than they had to. Now, I can't get that number to $0, not even close, but I can work with their accountant. I can point some things out and most likely give them some advice that will start saving them tax dollars tomorrow. And I think that's the value of working with a holistic financial planner. I think anyone out there who says that you can get your long-term tax bill down to zero, most likely they are cutting corners. They're what I would consider an aggressive accountant. If that's you listening, I apologize, but I think the promise of no tax burden is a false promise. But that said, I think the idea of buy, borrow, die, it continues on because some people just hate the idea of paying taxes. Some people, in fact, would rather end up with less money themselves as long as it meant they also had to pay fewer taxes along the way. The funny kind of metaphor is that they'd rather have 100% of a grape instead of 60% of a watermelon. Now, that's not me. I'll take 60% of the watermelon. I can, visualize that in my head, but it is some people. Some people would just rather have 100% of their little grape. And it's those kind of people who probably look at buy, borrow, die with rosy colored glasses. So awesome question, Hector. Thanks for writing in. And listeners, thank you all for tuning in today. Please send me your future AMA questions to jesse@bestinterest.blog, and we'll do our best to get them answered here on air. And I'll see you in a couple weeks for episode 100. It is sure to be a fun one.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Best Interest Podcast. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email at jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves, and we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Best Interest Podcast. The Best Interest Podcast is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice and is not prescriptive of your financial situation.